To this point, we've really been focused on physical development in infancy and toddlerhood, but now we turn our attention to cognitive development. So, how do those thinking skills develop over time? And all semester, we will, or at least during the period from now up through adolescence, we'll talk a little bit about cognitive development as it was viewed by Jean Piaget. So earlier in the semester, we took a look at the work of Jean Piaget, and you got a little bit of an introduction to his theory. He suggested that cognitive development occurs through a series of stages. And one of the things that he said about children is that they are like little scientists. So rather than just passively taking in the world and their experiences, he argued that children are constantly trying to make sense out of the world and those experiences that we're having. And so he suggested that in that way, they're like little scientists. They're taking in those experiences, they're trying to make sense of those experiences. So they're developing little theories, they're testing those theories, and that type of thing. Piaget suggested that there are 4 stages in cognitive development, and the first of his stages occurs during infancy and toddlerhood. But to understand his stages, it's important to first understand some basic principles that are part of his theory. These things that are noted on the slide, schema, assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration, are basic principles or basic concepts that are part of his theory. First of all, he suggests that our thinking is organized through schema. And a schema, according to Piaget and others, is simply a cognitive structure or a mental framework that helps us organize and interpret information from the environment. Piaget suggested that at birth, babies start to develop a lot of schema around actions. But then as they get older, their schema expand to other things. They may have schema about people, they may have schema about objects, about situations, that kind of thing. But again, they're basically just cognitive structures or mental frameworks that help us organize what we know about the world into sort of different categories. Now, as we go along in those first 2 years of life, and even as we get older, we are constantly having new experiences. And as we have those new experiences, we're taking new information in from our environment. We have to sort of see how that new information relates to our existing schema. And that's where a couple of processes that are part of his theory come into play, what he called assimilation and accommodation. Piaget suggested that when babies have new experiences, and again, not just babies, as we get older, we have those new experiences too. But of course, babies are having lots of new experiences in a short period of time. But as we have those new experiences, we try to fit them into our existing schema, or we try to compare them to our existing schema. And sometimes those new experiences fit pretty nicely into those existing schema, but there are times when we have to change our schema as a result of those new experiences that we have. We have to sort of think about that thing or that action or that person or the category for that in a different way. And so, again, that's where assimilation and accommodation come in. Assimilation is when information that we're taking in from those new experiences in our environment fits what we already know. So when we have a new experience that's related to an existing schema, and that new experience fits with our existing schema, we assimilate that new experience. So we just sort of take it into that schema that we already have for that experience. So your textbook defines it as fitting new environmental input into existing mental capacities. But basically what it means is you're taking that new experience and fitting it fits nicely into that existing framework, into what you already know about the world. But of course, sometimes we have experiences that don't really fit with what we already know about the world. And that's where the process of accommodation comes in. Accommodation is when you need to make changes to your knowledge because something that you're experiencing doesn't fit the existing schema. So the existing schema doesn't match exactly, and so you are now trying to change the schema in order to accommodate that new experience. So again, as an example, we might have a schema about birds, what birds are, what they do, how they act, characteristics that they have, and that type of thing. And to begin with, our bird schema might be that birds have beaks and wings and they fly. So those are the things, those are the characteristics of a bird. So maybe we've seen birds in our yard and people have named them for us, and these are things that we observe about the bird. But then we have a new experience. Let's say we go to a different place, and now we see a new kind of bird, a parrot, and we try to apply our existing schema, or we want to see, does this experience, does this new thing fit with that schema that we already have for bird? So we observe that bird and we see that, yeah, that bird has a beak, it has wings, it also flies. So yeah, that's a bird. It fits with our existing schema, and so we're able to assimilate this new experience into that existing bird schema that we already have. Then we have another new experience. We encounter a flamingo, and the flamingo, like the parrot and other birds that we've experienced up to that point, has a beak, it has wings, and it flies, but it is a different shape. So we're kind of assimilating beak, wing, flies. Yep, check. But this one looks pretty different from other birds that we've seen. So we have to do a little bit of accommodating. We have to add something new to our bird schema in order to accommodate this new experience that we're having with a bird. But then we have an experience or an encounter with another type of bird, a penguin. And so we are told that this is a bird, and we see that yes, it has a beak and it also has wings. It's a slightly different shape from these other birds that we've encountered, certainly a different shape from a flamingo. But a new thing about this bird is that it doesn't fly. And so now we have to accommodate. We have to change our existing bird schema to accommodate this new information. So that's sort of how that process of assimilation and accommodation occurs as we have those new experiences. Now, Piaget believed that for the most part, we go along and we are able to assimilate a lot, But occasionally we go through these periods where we're doing a lot of accommodation. We're finding that those existing schema don't really work so well anymore, and so we're accommodating, we're changing those schema pretty frequently. And he suggested that when that happens, when that occurs, it's going to cause some disruption and discomfort. You might think of it as being sort of like cognitive dissonance. And so there's disequilibrium that occurs. And he argued that at those points we go through this process of equilibration. And equilibration involves making pretty significant shifts in our thinking, so that we can deal with and really get rid of that discomfort from constant accommodation. And Piaget argued that equilibration occurs at 3 points in the lifespan as people move from stage 1 to stage 2 in his theory, stage 2 to stage 3, and stage 3 to stage 4. So when they're shifting from one stage to the next, that's when that equilibration is occurring. So in infancy and toddlerhood, during the first couple of years of life, children are in the stage of cognitive development that Piaget called the sensorimotor stage, or sensorimotor intelligence. This stage goes, of course, from birth to about 2 years of age, and there are a lot of changes that occur. A lot of changes for that child in lots of different ways. That child goes from taking in information through their senses and responding reflexively to taking in information through their senses and then responding intentionally. So he suggests that what's going on in this stage is that children are beginning to integrate sensory experiences with those motor experiences or their motor skills. And they're beginning to develop an understanding of how they can act and how their actions then have an impact on the environment around them. And so he suggested that one of the big things that characterizes these first 2 stages of development, or the first 2 years of life, are what he called circular reactions. And circular reactions are basically just repeated actions, repeating the same action over and over to sort of see what happens. So that experimentation that he was talking about in terms of the little scientists that he saw us as when we're children, when we are babies. But those circular reactions come in different types, and we see those different types occurring at different points during this sensorimotor stage. So we've got primary circular reactions, secondary circular reactions, and tertiary circular reactions. So we see those different types of circular reactions again coming up at different points in those first couple of years. But to make it a little bit more complicated, Piaget divided this first stage into 6 substages. And so, as we'll see, at the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th substages, that's when we see those different types of circular reactions coming into play. In that first substage, that's the substage of simple reflexes. And so at birth, babies respond reflexively, but even from their earliest days, they're beginning to adapt those reflexes. So during that period from birth to about a month of age, babies are responding reflexively and adapting those reflexes. But then as they get into the 2nd stage, from about 1 to 4 months of age, they've had an opportunity to have interesting experiences with their own body. And so he suggested this is when we begin to see what he called primary circular reactions, when that infant starts to repeat those actions with their own body that they found interesting. So just because it's interesting, they repeat those actions over and over. But again, the primary circular reactions involve actions with their own body. So it might be a matter of maybe they, just by accident, got a thumb into their mouth. Well, then they're going to repeat that action with their thumb because it had an interesting result. Maybe it felt good to them, maybe it was soothing or whatever, and so they repeat that action with their own body. But then as they get closer to that 4th month or into that period between 4 and 8 months, they begin to observe how their actions are influencing other things outside their body. And this is also developing along with the babies developing awareness of themselves, something that we'll talk about when we get to the material on social and emotional development. And they start to shift their attention to the environment, to things outside themselves. And they begin to see that their actions can sometimes have an influence over objects in their environment. And that's where the secondary circular reactions come into play. Those secondary circular reactions are when the infant is shifting to the environment, they're paying attention to the environment and exploring it a bit more. And so they may begin to repeat actions on things outside their body. So actions on objects that they can act on and have an impact on in some way. So as we get into that 4th stage, Piaget suggested that leading up to a year of age, what children are doing is that they are coordinating those secondary circular reactions. They start interacting in a goal-directed way. They want to see certain things happen with those objects. So they begin to coordinate their sensory abilities along with those actions in order to make things happen in the environment on objects outside of themselves. I can remember when my oldest was about this age, and we had begun to put her in a high chair, and as she sat in that high chair, one of the things that she would do is she would take an object off the tray of the high chair. So many times it might be like a teething toy or a rattle or something like that, and would then hold that object out to the side and drop it on the floor. And then oftentimes I would come pick it up, bring it back, put it on the tray, and in no time at all, she would pick it up, hold it out, drop it again. She found it interesting how she was influencing something outside her body, and so she started to repeat that action on something in the environment. And it could have been the toy that she found interesting. It could have been me, because not only were her actions influencing the toy, she was holding it out and dropping it so she could see what was happening with that, but I was also coming over and picking it up. And so in a sense, her actions were having an effect on me as an object too. And so she was repeating those, and she was learning how those were related to goal-directed behaviors. Now, as we get into the 5th substage, that's the substage in Piaget's theory that he called, or that where those tertiary circular reactions begin. And what he suggested is that this is when children really start doing that little scientist thing. They're really testing things out. So he suggested that in this stage, they start experimenting with the environment in goal-directed ways, but they try out new things with old objects. So things that they've seen impact one thing, they try it out on something else to see what happens with that as well. And so that's what he meant by tertiary circular reactions. They're repeating those same actions, but now they're using different things as a way of just kind of testing or experimenting. Now, that final substage involves continued tertiary circular reactions. But one of the big things that happens as children get into that period, the last half of that first year, is they begin to use symbolic thought. And part of the way we know they're doing that is that they're making more use of language. And language is, of course, a system of symbols. So words represent objects, people, actions, things like that. But using symbolic thought involves being able to hold mental representations in one's mind. And so he suggested that as children are using language, as they begin using gestures, they're beginning to develop an understanding of symbols. And so that, according to Piaget, is one of the big accomplishments of this stage, being able to use symbols pretty effectively. And so those symbols can include things like objects, or like language, gestures, that kind of stuff. But another thing he suggested really gives us a clue to the fact that, or sort of cues us in to the fact that children are capable of those mental representations, is what we call deferred imitation. And that's when children observe someone performing an action on one occasion, and then later in a different setting, they imitate that action. That suggests that they're able to hold that in their mind until that new situation and perform it there. And so, again, more evidence of their ability with symbolic thought or holding those mental representations. Now, one other thing that develops during this sensorimotor period that's associated with some of the accomplishments of this stage is the development of object permanence. And object permanence typically develops within that first year, probably a little bit earlier than Piaget felt we develop it. But object permanence is that understanding that even though an object is out of sight, it still exists. And so this is why for really young children, before they develop object permanence, the game of peekaboo is so interesting, because when you hide behind your eyes, in their mind, or behind your hands, in their mind, you're completely gone. And then suddenly you reappear. It's as if, oh, now you exist again, because they don't yet have object permanence. But when they develop object permanence, when you hide your face behind your hands, they start to look for your face because they understand that it still exists, it's just there behind your hands. And so their understanding of objects really begins to develop in this stage. The fact that objects are permanent, the fact that they can have an impact on those objects, or they can affect those objects. So their influence on those objects is another big accomplishment, understanding that, and then understanding symbolic thought.